Hello, everyone. Welcome to English Insights. Today, we will explore one of the most dramatic and emotional stories from World War II, the story of the Kamikaze pilots. These were young men who flew planes on one-way missions, ready to give their lives for their country. Why did Japan choose this plan? What did these pilots feel before their final flights? And what legacy did they leave behind? This story is not only about history, it is also a perfect chance for you to improve your English listening and understanding skills. You will learn new words, practice real sentences, and discover an unforgettable chapter of history. Now, let's get started. Part 1. The Origins of Kamikaze. By the year 1944, Japan was in deep trouble. At the beginning of World War II, Japan had shocked the world. Its army and navy had moved fast, capturing land across Asia and the Pacific. But after early victories, the situation changed. The United States and its allies began fighting back. Slowly, Japan lost control of the seas and skies. The American Navy was getting stronger. Their aircraft carriers and battleships moved closer and closer to Japan. U.S. planes bombed Japanese cities, destroying factories and supplies. Japan's army was stretched, fighting in too many places at once. For the first time, defeat seemed possible. Japan also had another serious problem: resources. They had very little fuel, very few planes, and not enough trained pilots. Young students were rushed into flight schools, but they had no time to become expert pilots. Japan needed something drastic. It was in this desperate moment that military leaders decided on a shocking new idea: suicide attacks. If Japan could not win in the air with skill, it would use the ultimate weapon: human sacrifice. Planes would no longer return to base. Instead, they would be filled with bombs and flown directly into American ships. This strategy was given a powerful name: kamikaze. The word means divine wind. It comes from a famous legend in Japanese history. In the 13th century, when Mongol armies tried to invade Japan, a great storm destroyed their ships. The Japanese believed this storm was sent by the gods to protect their land. Now, in World War II, the military leaders wanted to recreate that divine wind. But this time, the wind would be human pilots crashing into enemy ships. The kamikaze idea was both terrifying and symbolic. It showed Japan's desperation. But it also showed the power of the Japanese warrior code, Bushido, which valued honor, loyalty, and sacrifice for the emperor. When the first kamikaze plan was announced, many young pilots were told it was their duty. Some accepted it with pride, believing they were protecting their families and their country. Others felt fear, but could not refuse. In Japanese culture, refusing to sacrifice for the emperor was seen as shameful. The origins of the Kamikaze program were built on a mix of desperation, tradition, and propaganda. Japan's leaders promised that these suicide missions could turn the tide of the war. In reality, it was a sign that Japan was running out of options. Everything was ready now. Soon, young men would be trained not to return home, but to die in the skies for their emperor. Part 2. Training and Preparation. Once the Kamikaze plan was approved, Japan began to prepare young men for missions that had no return. These were not regular flights. They were one-way journeys. The goal was not survival, but sacrifice. Most of the Kamikaze pilots were very young. Many were university students, often between 17 and 22 years old. Some were volunteers, but many were pressured or persuaded to choose this path. At that time, Japan was filled with patriotic propaganda. Posters, newspapers, and radio broadcasts praised those who gave their lives for the emperor. The message was clear. To die for Japan was the highest honor. Training for kamikaze pilots was very different from normal flight school. Usually, pilots spent years learning how to fly, navigate, and fight in the air. But for kamikaze, only basic skills were needed. They learned how to take off, how to fly straight, and how to aim at a target. Landing was not important because they would never return. The training was short and strict. Commanders pushed the young men to accept death calmly. They were told to think of themselves as already dead. Some pilots practiced ceremonies before missions, almost like funerals for the living. But behind the military discipline, there was a human side. Many pilots kept diaries. Some wrote poems or personal notes. Others took photographs with friends in their flight units. Most of all, they wrote letters. In these letters, they spoke to parents, brothers, sisters, and sometimes girlfriends. They said goodbye, apologized for leaving, and promised to protect Japan with their sacrifice. Many letters ended with words like, "Please take care of yourself. I will watch over you from the skies." In Japanese tradition, honor was linked with the Bushido Code, the way of the samurai. The idea of giving your life for your master or emperor was not new. For centuries, samurai warriors had valued loyalty and self-sacrifice. The Kamikaze program used this tradition, telling young men that their deaths would be as noble as the samurai of the past. The preparation was not only physical, but also emotional and spiritual. Pilots were given special headbands called hachimaki, often with the rising sun symbol. These represented courage and determination. Before missions, many prayed at Shinto shrines. Some drank sake as part of a farewell ritual. On the outside, the preparation seemed full of pride and honor, but inside, many pilots struggled with fear. Some cried quietly at night. Others admitted in their diaries that they did not want to die, but they felt they had no choice. Refusing would bring shame to their families. Accepting meant at least they could die with honor. By the end of their training, the young men were ready, or at least, they had convinced themselves to be ready. They sat in their planes, with bombs attached, knowing that their next flight would be their last. The Kamikaze program had created not just soldiers, but human weapons. And soon, these weapons would be unleashed in battle. Part 3: First Missions and Impact. The first kamikaze missions happened in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. This was one of the largest naval battles in history. The United States had returned to the Philippines with a massive fleet. If Japan lost, it would lose control of its empire in Asia. The situation was desperate. On October 25th, a group of young Japanese pilots carried out the very first organized kamikaze attack. One of them was Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who had been chosen to lead. He was only 23 years old. Before the mission, Seki told a fellow officer, "Japan's future is dark if it must use such tactics. But as a soldier, I will do my duty." With those words, he climbed into his plane for the final time. That morning, the kamikaze planes dived onto American ships. One struck the aircraft carrier USS St. Lo. The explosion caused fires that spread quickly. In less than an hour, the St. Lo sank, killing more than 100 sailors. For the first time, the world had seen the power of the kamikaze. American sailors were shocked. They were used to fighting enemies who tried to survive. Now, they faced pilots who wanted to die. The psychological effect was huge. Many U.S. sailors described watching the planes coming down as terrifying. Some shouted warnings, others fired frantically. But nothing could stop the planes once they committed to the dive. In the days that followed, more kamikaze attacks hit other ships. The results were frightening. The planes were small compared to battleships, but a direct hit could destroy guns, planes, and fuel on deck. Even when a ship did not sink, many sailors were injured or killed. News spread quickly through the Allied forces. Stories of suicide planes filled newspapers. Some called it Japan's new secret weapon. Others described it as madness. But there was no doubt kamikaze had changed the war. For the Japanese, the first missions were seen as a success. Propaganda celebrated the heroes of Leyte Gulf. Newspapers printed their names and faces, calling them shining examples of sacrifice. The government told people that these young men had given their lives to protect Japan. Families were told to be proud, not sad. The impact went beyond numbers. Kamikaze made the U.S. Navy more cautious. Ships had to prepare stronger defenses. Sailors had to keep watch, day and night. Every small plane in the sky became a potential threat. The fear of sudden attack was always present. But even in this first stage, some Japanese leaders doubted. They knew the attacks could hurt the enemy, but they also knew that each kamikaze pilot was a life that could never be replaced. Japan was burning through its youth, in the hope of slowing down defeat. The first missions had shown the world both the effectiveness and the tragedy of the kamikaze. From this point on, the war in the Pacific would never be the same. Part 4. The Human Side of Kamikaze. Behind the news headlines and military reports, the kamikaze story was deeply human. The young men who became kamikaze pilots were not just soldiers. They were sons, brothers, students, and friends. Many of them had dreams of becoming teachers, doctors, or engineers. But in the final years of World War II, their lives were redirected toward sacrifice. Most kamikaze pilots were in their late teens or early 20s. Some were still in university when they were recruited. Many had never flown in real combat. They were given just a few weeks of basic training before being told that their destiny was to die for Japan. In public, they smiled for photographs, wearing white headbands, with the rising sun. In propaganda films, they looked brave and confident. But in private, their diaries and letters revealed something very different. Many of them were afraid. Some admitted they did not believe in the mission. Others confessed that they wanted to live, but felt trapped by duty. One young pilot wrote in his diary, "I want to live. I want to see my family again. But if I refuse, I bring shame to my parents, so I will go." Another wrote to his mother, "When you hear that I have died, please do not cry too much. Think of me as someone who protected the country." Before missions, pilots were encouraged to write farewell letters. Some wrote poetry in the traditional Japanese style. A few left locks of hair or small personal items for their families to remember them by. These letters and poems are still kept today in museums across Japan. They show the painful mixture of pride, fear, and sadness inside these young men. There were also moments of normal human life. Some pilots laughed with friends on the night before their mission. Others sang songs, played games, or drank sake. For a short while, they could forget what awaited them. But the next morning, reality returned. They climbed into their planes, bowed to their comrades, and took off on their final journey. Not all kamikaze pilots wanted this fate. Some were forced or pressured to volunteer. In the strict culture of wartime Japan, saying no was almost impossible. Refusing meant dishonor. not only for the pilot, but also for his entire family. For many, agreeing to die was the only way to protect their loved ones from shame. The human side of Kamikaze also shows the tragedy of wasted youth. These men were not fanatics. Many were ordinary young people who loved literature, music, and sports. Their diaries often mention missing home, missing friends, and longing for simple joys like watching the sunset or walking through this countryside. But when the time came, they flew toward death. Some hit their targets, others were shot down before reaching enemy ships. All of them carried with them a story of sacrifice that was both heartbreaking and unforgettable. The Kamikaze program was not just a military tactic, it was a human drama filled with tears, courage, and loss. And it reminds us that behind every symbol of war, there are always real people with real lives. Part 5: Decline and Desperation. After the first kamikaze missions in 1944, Japanese leaders believed they had found a weapon that could slow down the American advance. At first, the attacks shocked the U.S. Navy and caused serious damage. But as the war continued into 1945, the situation changed. The Americans quickly adapted. Warships added more anti-aircraft guns. Radar systems were improved so that suicide planes could be detected earlier. Fighter patrols were sent into the skies to shoot down kamikaze planes before they reached the fleet. Slowly, the element of surprise was lost. At the same time, Japan was running out of skilled pilots. The first kamikaze units had included young men with at least some training. But by mid-1945, Japan was sending barely trained teenagers into the air. Many had only practiced takeoff and basic flying. They were asked to crash into heavily defended American ships. Few ever made it close. The results became tragic. For every kamikaze pilot who hit a target, many others were shot down or lost at sea. Hundreds of lives were spent for little effect. Still, Japanese commanders demanded more. They believed that mass sacrifice could inspire fear and possibly force the Americans to negotiate. During the Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, kamikaze attacks reached their peak. More than 1,500 suicide missions were launched. American ships were damaged, and thousands of sailors were killed or wounded. But the U.S. fleet kept coming. Despite the pain, the Americans did not retreat. Instead, the heavy losses only made them more determined to end the war. For the kamikaze pilots, the atmosphere grew darker. Early on, there had been pride and honor in the mission. Now, there was mostly pressure and despair. Diaries from late 1945 show growing hopelessness. One pilot wrote, "I wonder if my death will change anything. Japan is already lost." Another asked, in his farewell note, Is this sacrifice truly for the nation, or are we only wasting lives? The desperation spread beyond the skies. Japan also created special suicide boats, tiny submarines, and even human torpedoes. These, too, were sent against the Americans with little success. It was as if the nation was burning through its last hope, using people as its final weapon. By the summer of 1945, it was clear Kamikaze could not stop defeat. Japan's cities lay in ruins from American bombing raids. Supplies of fuel and food were almost gone. And when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, the dream of saving Japan through sacrifice was finally over. The decline of the Kamikaze program showed the limits of desperation. The courage of the young pilots was real, but their missions could not change the outcome of the war. Instead, they revealed the tragic cost of a strategy built on human lives. Part 6: Legacy of the Kamikaze. When the war ended in August 1945, the Kamikaze program also came to an end. Japan surrendered after the atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The dream of using human sacrifice to save the nation had failed. More than 3,800 young pilots had died in suicide missions. Thousands more had been trained but never flown. Their lives were part of one of the most extreme chapters in military history. After the war, the memory of the Kamikaze became complicated. For some Japanese, the pilots were remembered as heroes who gave everything for their country. Families displayed photographs of sons who had died in the missions. In shrines and memorials, their names were written alongside other soldiers who had fallen in battle. For these families, the Kamikaze symbolized loyalty and honor. But for many others, the story was different. They saw the Kamikaze as a tragedy, the waste of a generation of young men who had been pressured into death. Diaries and farewell letters revealed fear, doubt, and sadness. These writings showed that many pilots were not eager heroes, but ordinary boys caught in an impossible situation. In this view, the Kamikaze program was not glorious, but cruel. Around the world, the Kamikaze left a lasting impression. For American sailors, the memory of suicide planes diving from the sky remained vivid for decades. The image of aircraft turning into weapons of human sacrifice shocked the world and became a symbol of the desperation of Japan's final days. In modern Japan, the Kamikaze story is still debated. Museums such as the Chiran Peace Museum for Kamikaze pilots keep letters, uniforms, and photographs to help people understand the human side of the missions. Visitors read the final words of the pilots and often leave in silence, reflecting on the pain of war. The legacy is also a lesson. It reminds us how war can push nations into terrible choices. The Kamikaze program showed how leaders, faced with defeat, used the bodies and lives of their own youth as weapons. It is a warning about what happens when human life is treated as expendable. But the kamikaze also represent courage. In a tragic way, the young men who climbed into those planes knew they would not return. Whether they believed in the mission or not, they faced death directly. Their bravery was real, even if their sacrifice could not change the outcome of the war. Today, the story of the kamikaze is remembered as both a symbol of loyalty and a symbol of loss. It is a part of Japan's history that cannot be forgotten, and it continues to raise questions about duty, honor, and the cost of war. The kamikaze pilots did not save Japan, but their story still speaks to us. It reminds us of the power of belief, the tragedy of wasted youth, and the importance of peace. In the end, their legacy is not only about death, but also about the value of life.